Hello, we're live in London and you're listening to Monocle on Sunday. I'm Georgina Godwin. Coming up today here at Midori House in London, my guests David Schlesinger and Alex von Tunzelmann will share their views on this week's biggest stories. David and Alex, what have you spotted?
Well, I mean, there's really only one story that anyone's talking about this morning, which, of course, is that somebody shot at Donald Trump during a rally in the US.
Absolutely. I woke up just after it happened and there's been nothing else in the feeds of any note whatsoever.
And, of course, we'll be looking at that story in some detail. We'll also get the latest news from Istanbul.
I'm Lucinda Smith, and coming up later, I'll be bringing you the latest tourism news from Turkey, including how the economy, climate and Turkish television series all affect the industry.
Plus, Monocle's editorial director, Tyler Brûlé, will be joining us from Liguria in Italy. It's the 14th of July 2024, Bastille Day. This is Monocle on Sunday.
Live from London, this is Monocle on Sunday with Georgina Godwin.
Now, as we heard from our panellists, the attempted assassination of Donald Trump is dominating news coverage. Here is the audio.
Take a look at what happened.
Well, joining me now is Scott Lucas, who's adjunct professor at the Clinton Institute, University College Dublin, who can tell us more. Scott, can you tell us what we were listening to there? What happened?
So as Donald Trump was beginning his speech at a campaign rally in Butler, Pennsylvania, north of Pittsburgh, late Saturday afternoon, there was several popping sounds. Trump reached back to his right ear as if he had been hit by something. We later found out he had been grazed by a bullet. He dropped to the ground. He was only lightly injured. Secret Service agents immediately were on top of him to protect him. However, there was at least one attendee who was killed. Two were critically wounded. The shooter has now been apprehended. The shooter was killed at the site. He's now been identified. He was a 20-year-old from Pennsylvania. We do not know his motive, why he did it. But what has happened in the immediate aftermath, in fact, it started even at the rally itself. What a lot of your listeners will see this morning is the iconic photograph of Trump raising his fist in the air as he's surrounded by Secret Service agents with the American flag in the background. The iconic soundbite, however, and putting this shooting into wider context, is that Trump tells the Secret Service agents, wait, so he can get that pose for the cameras. And then he points at his supporters and says, fight. And so the wider context for me discussing this today, both as an analyst and personally, this is my native country, is where this episode fits into the recent history of political violence in America. Much of that violence, it must be said, whipped up by Trump. And whether we are going to see a further descent into political violence, in part because of the exploitation of this event. And again, probably in particular, in fact, it's already happening, by supporters of Donald Trump and by the candidate himself.
Scott, thank you very much indeed. Now, also joining us is our head of radio, Tom Edwards. Tom, what's your take on this?
Well, I think, Georgina, look, Scott's cut to the heart of this, which is that the broader context is this general fomenting of political polarization, of aggressive language, of political rhetoric that goes beyond the rhetorical to incite action. And I think that's the core concern. I think, one of Monocle's obligations really in a way, though, is to try and encourage listeners to retain some detachment, take a step back, still look at the broader context. And in a sense, it's very difficult to wholly separate this from the prevailing discourse around who is going to be contesting the ballot, in November, and what are the key dynamics. And I think the big shift, the worry, exactly as Scott says, obviously in the short term, is that violence begets further violence. But it's also, does the narrative, does the discourse shift away from these more fundamental questions to more personality politics? And this feels like a terrible, I don't know, perhaps somehow inevitable conclusion or corollary to the approach to political life that someone like Trump takes. I mean, I'm struggling. I think back now, I remember as a kid seeing old footage of the Hinckley assassination attempt of Ronald Reagan, which I think you and Scott know these things better than me, Georgina. It was 81, I think. But, we're just not used to seeing this kind of political activity. Now, we don't know the motive. As usual, it could be some crazy loner. But look at these margins, grazed by a bullet. I don't know. It's scary. It's horrifying. I think if it can have anything, if anything positive can come of it, is it that we can reset the narrative and get back to real fundamentals? We just had a general election in this country that was completely free and fair. It was characterized by extraordinarily generous and inclusive speeches, both for the victors and the vanquished. Does something as awful as this, and the narrowness of the attempt, of the miss of the attempt on Trump's life, could we try and seize that narrative positive? As Scott's already pointed out, given the diatribes from Trump, perhaps understandably in the heat of the moment, it doesn't look like that's what's probably going to happen.
Yeah, I'd like to bring in Tyler Brûlé now, our editorial director. He's in Liguria, and I know we'll be speaking about Italy a little bit later in the programme, Tyler, but I just wanted your take on this shocking news overnight.
Good morning, Georgina. Of course, if you look at the papers from the continent elsewhere around the world, I think one of the interesting things we're seeing in a European context, that transatlantic context of really looking from this side of the Atlantic towards Washington and the wider United States, is this question of whether this will unite America. The NZZ out of Switzerland leads with quite a good, very punchy short piece of analysis that just went up over the last few hours, which really begs the question, seeing this call for USA, and this very sort of powerful image, which will definitely become probably a defining image, certainly for the first part of this century, for sure. Is whether America is going to rally together. Is this a moment of bringing the nation together as one, or is this just driving a further wedge? It's a well argued piece. It doesn't run too long. And then, of course, if you look at the Wall Street Journal, also quite a significant, I wouldn't quite call it an op-ed piece, but certainly an opinion piece this morning as well, which of course raises the question of divisiveness. Of course, the Wall Street Journal leaning, of course, a little bit right of center, and of course raising many questions, across the political spectrum. Democrats who've been using, not particularly pleasant language around, of course, Donald Trump, and of course, vice versa. We know the rhetoric that, of course, have come from many corners of the Republican camp as well, and this is, of course, there are many things amidst all of this, and I think one thing which will be interesting to see is, of course, what are we going to find out, of course, about, of course, the gentleman who, of course, attempted the assassination? What type of backing did he have? It's quite remarkable when you look at the footage of the return fire that occurred, that how was someone able to get on a rooftop? And of course, with, again, and this, of course, will be another conversation as well about assault-style weaponry in the United States. Of course, something which is very much backed by many corners of the Republican camp as well. Do we really need these types of weapons? That aside, how did this happen?
Yeah, absolutely. Tyler, I want to return to you in just a moment. First, a quick reaction from my guests in the studio. They are David Schlesinger, who's an independent advisor and commentator on media, journalism and China, and Alex von Tunzelmann, an historian, author and screenwriter. This really will make history, won't it, Alex?
Well, of course, in a sense, although I do think we need to push back a bit on the idea that this is unprecedented. I mean, Steve Scalise, US representative, was shot in 2017. Gabby Gifford, US representative, was shot in the head, severe brain damage in 2011. In fact, there have been quite a lot of political shootings in America. This isn't completely unprecedented.
Yeah, David.
Well, I think we have to look also just at the election coming up only in November. For the last several weeks, this has not been an election about policy. It's been an election about potency. And now when you have a picture of Trump with his arm raised, face flushed, blood splattered, next to a picture of Biden, pale, emaciated, weak, staring into space, I think that potency argument becomes even more strong. So I see this as definitely helping Trump in the short term, but in terms of the divisiveness in America, it's not going to help. No. It's only going to hurt.
Absolutely. Tyler, of course, this is very much the defining feature of America as we from outside see it, this whole gun culture, as you mentioned. But you're in Italy right now. Guns, obviously not quite so apparent there. But in your column today, I was very interested that you were looking at what the defining issues are, or what the defining food is, for instance, or the hospitality is of various countries, and how really that should be relied upon to temper tourism, to attract the right kind of people. And I wondered if you could just tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, Georgina, you give me the not insignificant task of course, shifting from what is the dominating news story to, of course, one from this stretch, almost really the westernmost edges of Italy. But this is also becoming a bit of a theme, a bit of a Monocle mantra, where, of course, on one side, we're looking at protests in cities and regions that have erupted around the Mediterranean. And of course, these are all focused on mass tourism. How do you curb the size of cruise ships, or the types of cruise ships, or how many cruise ships come into your harbor every day? As much as the type of tourist as well. And one thing I've been thinking about, and this is, I'm in this little stretch of Liguria, which is, it's just incredibly Italian. So there are a lot of tourists, but all those tourists, I would say 98% of them are Italian. So they've come from elsewhere in Liguria to the beach. They've come from Piemonte. They might be from parts of Lombardia as well. So you have people, of course, who understand the code. You're amongst your own nationals. And I think what happens, and what I was just thinking about, is it's amazing that when you have all of these codes and customs, and they are, I would say, quite rigid in a way, you're suddenly not sort of opening up the doors, or you're not sort of so amenable to maybe the taste of the modern tourist who wants 5 types of pillow, who expects to have air conditioning set at 18 degrees, who expects that they can substitute the entire menu. But these are things that have happened across the Mediterranean, that of course economies want to attract tourists from all corners of the world. They want to be seen to be hospitable. Heaven forbid that someone attempts to shame them online, that they're being called insensitive, non-inclusive. But in a way, I would say that actually that's just a very, very simple way of just sticking to your guns. You don't need protests. You don't need to have mass rallies against it. Just do what you've always done. And I go back to sort of the grand tours that, of course, went through, of course, these stretches of Europe, centuries ago, and there was a sense of the exotic, coming to explore these places, but you had to do it on the terms of the locals.
So what is it then, do you think, that Italians do best?
I think the Italians do many things well, and this is, again, I think these things become so, in a way, they just reveal themselves, in the evening during the passeggiata, when you don't have sort of, conflicting people who are interrupting the flow, who don't know how the flow operates and works. So people who sort of understand, when you make a reservation for a restaurant, how do you queue up when you go for your gelato in the evening, whatever it may be. All of these codes become very, very pronounced. So the one thing that does strike you, which Italy continues to do very well, it's just so multi-generational. And you see that everybody is out, from the great-grandchildren, the grandchildren, the kids, the parents, and the grandparents. Everybody is brought along, whether they're in a walker or whether they're in a pram, whether they're completely mobile, but that the family is out. And I think at a time, of course, when we're just as we heard a little bit earlier, when we're talking about potency, that you see that, if you're 80 plus, 90 plus, you're also included as part of the family, that you're not left up in the apartment, even if you're remotely mobile. I think that's one thing. The other thing, go ahead, Georgina.
You're seeing all of those people too on the beach too, and one thing that Italy does extremely well is beach clubs.
Beach clubs. beach clubs being leathery, wearing lots of gold, these things still endure, and that idea of course, that everyone has, a right to still wear, the tiniest bikini or thong, whether they're, male, female, whatever. I think that is kind of a remarkable thing. And again, this is a moment when we have, a lot of legislation, a number of issues looking at should, the Italian beach club, as we know it, should it be stripped from the sands? Should the beaches sort of be open to everybody? But I would almost argue that this actually needs UNESCO protection because, okay, listen, yes, there could be a little bit more public beach, but I'd also say that when you have someone who is in charge of the beach, it's private, then of course you have some skin in the game to make sure it's absolutely clean, immaculate, there are no cigarette butts. And I would sort of challenge, those who want to see all beaches completely open, that, is the government really going to be there to sort of clear every cigarette butt, to get the floating nappies out of the water, whatever it may be. But I think that is something, and you see also, I say UNESCO heritage protection, because there's something cultural about this, that you see that just generations and generations grow up, and there's a real sense of community at a time when we know that that's what so many mayors, that so many legislators are trying to figure out. How do you bring generations together? How do you keep extended families intact? How do you, of course, keep communities safe? And I think there is this, high degree, we talk a lot about social capital, and that's exactly what you have. And maybe my last point is also, it's actually, again, in an era when we're trying to get people to turn off, beaches are not very friendly to mobile phones. So, sun, sand, certainly salt as well on the screen. It's not great for your phone, even if you've got the biggest parasol. And what you do notice as well is that people do have to turn to crossword puzzles. They do have to turn to reading, Gazzetta dello Sport. They have to read off of paper, or they're just simply in the sea, playing with, paddles and balls and just out and away from screens. So I think culturally, I think there also needs to be a degree of protection around that. So those are things that the Italians are doing well, Georgina.
Absolutely. Tyler, of course, today is not a normal day, and I would generally ask you, well, obviously you're going to switch off your phone today, you're going to be on the beach, but what does a man who is a dyed-in-the-wool journalist with ink running through his veins do on holiday when a story like this breaks?
Yeah, it is very difficult to, of course, get away from screens. One of the curious things, though, I was actually having a conversation with the hotel where I'm staying at. There's 800 Italian channels. There are, there's a few German and French channels as well. But oddly, there is no BBC World. There is no CNN. And maybe on a day like today, of course, where we have the ability, and of course we're a news gathering organization ourselves, so we have our own sources and resources to rely on. Of course, one's going to sort of dip in and look at the screen, but also this is it's one of these stories where you want deep analysis. And as I mentioned as well, it's one of those stretches of Italy. It's very hard to find a print copy of the FT or the New York Times. I managed to go to the next village. I did find the only copy of the FT Weekend yesterday. I will probably go back to that same village. I might have missed the New York Times. I'm very keen to, of course, maybe indulge in some long reads, because this is going to be a story, I think, when we look at this, this attempted assassination, a 20-year-old, of course, suspect, obviously who is suspect, but also is no longer with us, was killed, obviously, by the Secret Service. But what is the whole backstory behind this? At 20 years old, maybe not very difficult to get a gun, but, what was this really sort of thought out so meticulously, on his own? And of course, these are the questions that are going to have to be answered, of course, by various media outlets.
Absolutely. Tyler, thank you very much indeed. I wish you as a relaxing day as you can possibly have in Liguria. And just coming back to my panellists now, David Schlesinger and Alex von Tunzelmann, very, very difficult to get away from this story. And I just wonder what it is for you, Alex. What did you first think when this news came up?
Well, I saw it first thing this morning when I woke up. And I mean, I think I suppose, okay, so coming at it as a historian rather than just a journalist, you try and take a longer view. So one of the things that's very clear is that actually there'll be a great deal of confusion right now, and a lot of the information will be contradictory and confusing, and especially on social media, lots of people will be trying to put forward theories and ideas which may be poorly sourced and so forth. So actually, in many ways, I think Tyler should probably keep his phone off and stay on the beach, because actually it will probably take some time for the facts really to emerge about exactly what has gone on, in as much as we will ever know, because of course, the suspect is dead.
And what facts can we actually rely on? I think that's my concern about this whole thing, is that it will be like the great Japanese movie Rashomon, that everyone will see it from a different perspective. I mean, even the first stories about the man who's dead, he was a registered Republican. Okay, so one side can jump on that, but he apparently made a $15 donation to a progressive cause through a Democratic website. So the other side couldn't jump on that. So the way you will interpret the quote unquote facts will depend on your point of view, on what bubble you're in, what social media world you live in. And I'm really quite concerned that this is just going to be weaponized by both sides, and it will, instead of bringing the country together, as I think, Georgina, you expressed a hope that it might in the beginning. I don't think it will. I think it will serve to tear things even more apart.
Well, I'd like to carry on with that theme of unity, actually, because, I mean, as Tom was saying earlier, you've seen an election happen here in Britain. It was free and fair, but the two sides very, very divided. The United States couldn't be more divided. Well, today is the day that France celebrates unity. It is Bastille Day, the anniversary of the storming of the Bastille on the 14th of July, 1789. It was a major event of the French Revolution, and it celebrates, the day now celebrates the unity of the French people on that day. Of course, France is anything but unified at the moment, Alex.
Yes, I mean, this is rather striking, I think, on today. I mean, and, you know, I was one of those who was profoundly relieved last week when Marine Le Pen did not win the French elections. But, of course, there is now a state of confusion, difficulty, and sort of how do we resolve this? But I suppose that's democracy. It doesn't always come up with clear instructions. It doesn't always come up with clear solutions. And actually, this just has to be muddled through.
Well, in China, there isn't really much room for disunity. You sort of do what you're told, David, don't you?
Well, below the surface, there's a lot of disunity and unhappiness. I think that's what the Communist Party is dealing with right now. We're coming into a very interesting time. Monday begins the third plenum of the Central Committee, which sounds very nerdish, but in fact, in Chinese political terms, it's quite important. Third plenums come around once every 5 years, and the third plenum is the time when they reset policy around the economy and around society. They actually didn't do it last time, so this will be the first. Last time the third plenum was much more, really very nerdish about the way the party was structured. So this is going to be the first economic reset we've had in a while, and they need it because they have to restore some faith and some confidence in the economy. Young people in particular are feeling quite battered at the moment in terms of whether they can get ahead, whether they will live a life better than their parents. And in the global situation, when the United States has turned 180 degrees against China and is trying to bring Europe with it in a very anti-China, with a lot of anti-China rhetoric and policies, it's not a very comfortable time in China. And so I think this third plenum will be quite interesting to see whether they will be able to counteract some of the societal pressures that have been building up in the housing market, in terms of an urban-rural divide, in terms of opportunities for younger people.
When we examine this alarming turn to the right within Europe, how obvious is that kind of rhetoric in China?
Well, nationalist rhetoric is very strong. And if you get away from a left-right divide and just think about sort of nationalism as an organizing principle, that's really what the whole issues around Taiwan in particular have been about a resurgence of a Chinese dream, a resurgence of China as a unified power, overcoming all the humiliations of the 19th century and early 20th. So century and really standing up on its own. So I would get away from left-right divide, because in a Chinese context that becomes very complicated with a communist party in power. But I would say in terms of nationalist rhetoric, in terms of country-first rhetoric, it's very much of a piece in terms of what you see in Russia, in Trumpism in the US, and in Europe.
You know what I find really interesting is that nationalism, when it's used in the context of somewhere like China or Russia, is seen as a negative. But when you talk about nationalist movements in colonial Africa, when you talk about those newly independent African countries, nationalism is what drove that. Nationalism is what still drives many of those countries. And yet we do not see this generally as a failing, Alex.
Well, nationalism is a word that's used in a number of quite complex ways. So it's a bit of a simplistic word in some ways. I mean, because, yes, of course, most anti-imperial movements would be regarded as nationalist because, of course, they were attempting literally to establish a nation. And, of course, what you see in a lot of former colonial dominions and so forth is that you have quite a unified nationalist movement, which actually, once independence is achieved, splits, because often the thing binding them together was, in fact, the idea of independence and nationalism. And in fact, there tend to be really quite different points of view contained within that. I mean, you could actually sort of see something like that happening with the Scottish National Party in the UK quite recently, which is actually a very, very broad church of opinions. And now the sort of nationalism possibility has receded. You can see it sort of collapsing around that. But then, yes, it's used in a different way, the word nationalism, also to mean these huge countries like China, which I don't think, very much could be these days regarded as an imperial power, really. Certainly, if you look at certain undertakings in Africa and Latin America and so forth, is really telling a national myth about itself. And I mean, in a sense, I think often what you find is that nationalism is what's pushed by a government, Russia and China, which is actually failing to improve things on a material level for people. But this kind of theme of nationalism is something very strong that can be pushed to unite people regardless of what the government is actually doing.
And that brings us full circle to the first report on the Trump assassination attempt, where you have these shouts of USA, USA, USA. What exactly does that mean? What does it mean for a rally in rural Pennsylvania to shout USA after their candidate is shot at? What is the thought process there? USA, we're strong, we'll go against our own people. USA, we're strong, we'll go against 20-year-old losers who are our neighbors. USA, we're strong, we'll go against the Democrats. It's a rallying cry. It's a nationalistic rallying cry. It shouts the name of the country. But what does it mean? I haven't a clue.
It's a fascinating response, isn't it?
Yeah, it really, really is. And, I've been doing a lot of reading about Germany in the Second World War at the moment. And it picking up on the nationalism theme here, a lot of people, or some people who fought for the Nazis, did it for their country and not for Hitler. They did it not necessarily because they were Nazis, but because they were patriots. But a lot of people that defied the Nazis also, of course, did it for their country. Now, there's a fascinating exhibition you found in Berlin, Alex, that I know you've done some work around for a documentary series you've been writing.
Yes, on the BBC, History's Secret Heroes is a show that I write and is presented by Helena Bonham Carter, who has a much nicer voice than I do.
I just have to butt in there and tell you I was at a party with her this week, and she insisted that everybody wore hats.
Excellent. Well, I think we should all wear more hats. I'm with her on that. But yes, it's about basically these kind of people in the Second World War that we may not have heard of, who often defied fascism and so forth, and, in various ways, and tried to do their own things. So this exhibition in Berlin looks really wonderful. It's an exhibition of women who resisted Nazism within Germany. And of course, many of us will have heard of Sophie Scholl, and sort of leading the resistance. But I think this really broadens it out to a much wider picture. And I mean, one of the striking things when you look at resistance to Nazism is actually how little of it there was. I think that's often something worth commenting on. That in and of itself is worthy of study and is very widely studied. But I was fascinated to learn about some of the people in this exhibition. I was also very glad actually to see a big focus on Marlene Dietrich, who I think is underrated as a resistor, who of course was a German film star, but moved to the US and really, fought very, very hard. against the Nazi regime from there and did an awful lot of work for it. So it's quite fascinating to see figures like her being brought back.
Absolutely. Now, now it's just coming up to 17:30 in Turkey. That's 10:30 in Ankara, 9:30 here in London. So what I'd like to do on Monocle on Sunday next is bring in Hannah Lucinda Smith. She's our correspondent in Istanbul. Good morning to you, Hannah.
Good morning.
I understand it's terrifically hot throughout the Mediterranean.
It is indeed. We've been probably basking is the wrong word. We've been suffering through a heat wave here in Istanbul and also along the coast and in Greece's Aegean Islands. It's obviously, this part of the world is known for its sunny summers, but this year, the humidity, particularly in Istanbul, is really, really making things quite unbearable. And even last week, I was in Greece, and on a couple of days there were weather warnings from the government, basically warning people not to go out during the day. It was absolutely stifling hot. And as a lot of people might know, there's been a spate of really tragic incidents in Greece in the first few weeks of this summer. Tourists going out for walks, not being adequately prepared, and it's really, really easy to see how that can be done in temperatures like this.
Absolutely. And I mean, they're actually trialling something in Athens, aren't they? Closing the Acropolis during the hottest hours.
Yeah, absolutely. And, Athens is, famously Europe's hottest capital. It is one of the places that is really suffering with kind of rising temperatures and climate change. And if you know the Acropolis, getting up there is a bit of a slog. There's not a lot of shade up there. You're very, very exposed to the sun. And, just even being up there for kind of half an hour in these kind of temperatures is really, really dangerous, particularly if you have health conditions, if you're pregnant, if you're old. The Greek government is taking steps to try and limit the danger to tourists by closing that and other attractions in the hottest days.
And is Turkey doing something similar?
Yeah, but Turkey's got a really interesting programme that it started this summer. Not altogether about climate change, but it's something that is really appealing to tourists in these kind of temperatures. 5 of the most famous antique cities, including Ephesus, also Side, Aphrodisias, they are now open until midnight. They generally, like most museums in Turkey, kind of close at the end of the working day. But again, in these kind of temperatures, to wander around places like that in the middle of the day, not very pleasant. And they've been attracting huge evening crowds, both because it's really quite a magical thing to see these places in the evening when they're sort of beautifully lit up, but also it's just so much more comfortable to explore them in the evening once the sun has gone down. And I think in the coming years, as these kind of climates and climate change and temperatures in the summer persist, I think we're going to be seeing more kind of projects like that, sort of realignment of tourism to take in the fact that the temperatures are rising.
Well, we were just speaking to Tyler Brûlé, our editorial director, a little bit earlier, who's in Liguria, and he was saying that there's a startling lack of international tourists in that region. And of course, we know that in Turkey, some popular resorts are also emptier than usual.
Yeah, I mean, this has been a really big news story here in Turkey. Places like Bodrum, hugely popular place, both with kind of well-heeled Turks and also with foreign tourists. Cheshme, a bit further north, which is very, very popular with local tourists. This summer, pretty much empty. I've been seeing tradesmen being interviewed saying we are just getting absolutely no business. Beaches are empty, the hotels are empty. And it's really shocking because over the past few years, particularly since the pandemic finished, these places have been so popular. But the thing that has really killed them this year is Turkey's inflation and the rising prices. Already over the past couple of years, particularly in Bodrum, which is known as the kind of really high-end place in Turkey, prices for sunbeds, you're talking in some beach clubs sort of, €100 or more just to get in. Huge prices for food and drink. And that's already over recent years kind of stopped as many Turks going on holiday as might have done before. But now it's also impacting on the foreign tourism sector as well. I think foreign tourists, whereas a few years ago they would have looked at Turkey and gone, this is a really good value place, far cheaper than Greece or Italy. Now they're looking at the price and like, actually, Greece is almost the more economic option. And it's really interesting. When I was in Greece last week, just a huge amount of Turkish tourists. That's both because the visa has been simplified for them for some Greek islands, but also just economically, it makes more sense now. And that's something quite startling when you think, Turkey is not in the Eurozone. It's far lower average incomes in places like Greece, and yet holidays here have become so expensive.
But some tourists are travelling there because of a really huge Turkish TV drama.
Yeah, absolutely. And not just one. Turkish TV dramas, they're called dizi in Turkish. So these kind of sprawling, hundreds of episodes, hundreds of hours, very sumptuous dramas that usually centre around family dramas, sometimes with a historical bent as well, are popular not just in Turkey, but have been marketed all over the world. The marketing board, which looks after this in Turkey, estimates that 400 million people worldwide are watching Turkish series, and that's bringing in a lot of tourists, particularly to Istanbul, where which provides the backdrop for a lot of these series, where a lot of these series are also filmed in the big studios here. It's something that I noticed starting about a decade ago. First of all, it was a lot of tourists from the Arab world. The series are very, very popular there. But now also European tourists are coming here. It's almost like the kind of Game of Thrones tourism that you saw in places like Dubrovnik or Northern Ireland. It's that kind of tourism bringing people here to Istanbul.
I noticed that last night a big Turkish drama premiered on British television, all about a detective.
The Turkish Detective. Yeah, this is based on a series of novels by Barbara Nadell, who's a British writer. I'm not sure if she has Turkish connections as well. But she's so good at using Istanbul as the backdrop for these amazing thrillers. I really do recommend watching that if you have the chance.
Hannah, thank you very much indeed. That's Hannah Lucinda Smith, who was speaking to us from Istanbul. Well, my panellists are still with me. They are David Schlesinger and Alex von Tunzelmann. And Hannah was just talking about some television series based on a Turkish novel. Of course, a very well-known Turkish novelist here in Britain is Elif Shafak. She has a new book out, just about to be published, I think. It's called There Are Rivers in the Sky. And this follows a drop of water that comes back in different forms, sometimes as hail or a raindrop and things, over various centuries, and kind of picks up on history with all of this water coming through. Water that then goes on to feed wonderfully clear streams and seas and so on. Sadly, let's go back to tourism. That is not the case here in Britain, where our water and our seas appear to be full of sewage. Davis, tell us more.
Well, water security is actually one of my obsessions at the moment, because I really worry that is going to be the story of the coming decades. If you look at the map of countries that are suffering or will be suffering, I think that that whole area in northern Africa is going to be sending thousands, millions of refugees up into Western Europe in coming decades, just in search of basic living conditions. Now, you mentioned that we've had problems here in the UK, and that's true. There's a major scandal around Thames Water and its ability to manage the infrastructure, manage sewage, manage prices, and huge questions about whether privatization was the right thing to do or not. But that is almost secondary to the question is, how is our planet going to manage to keep potable water available for the millions and billions of people who actually need it? And I don't have a good answer for that because I don't see that any government is actually trying to come to terms with this now. So I see water security as going to be the major crisis point just in probably the next 2 decades, 3 decades.
I mean, it is the huge pinch point, isn't it, Alex?
Massively. And I think if you look, so for instance, the region I'm pretty familiar with in South Asia, one of the big issues with India and Pakistan is that the Punjab, largely part of which is in Pakistan, means 5 rivers, and the headworks for those rivers are basically in Kashmir, the disputed region, and this is actually one of the big factors in the dispute and the difficulty around there. And it's certainly, when you've already got a region which is politically volatile on the question of the relation between India and Pakistan and so forth, adding into that water security is really dangerous. And I think David's absolutely right that this is a really major coming issue. And yes, it is also an issue in Western countries and in all sorts of countries, but of course in areas of insecurity, it's another factor that can really set light to things.
And it's going to drive migration enormously.
Yeah, absolutely. Wars are one thing, but just whether you can have a glass of water, whether you can wash, whether you can cook, these are the basic questions of life that will drive people to do desperate things.
But we have new solutions for these things now. I mean, surely this is where something like AI would come into its own.
If you use AI for the right things, if you have some kind of concerted effort around it, then possibly yes. But one of the things that really worries me about AI is it's become extremely fragmented. We were talking about China earlier, and one of the major themes that I see is that we're splitting into a world of Chinese AI and rest of the world AI. Just last month, OpenAI said it was cutting China off from its large language models. The U.S., of course, has been trying to restrict China's ability to use the chips needed for AI. So one of two things will happen. Either China will shrivel a bit in terms of technological development, but I don't think that will happen. I think what it will happen is that China will be spurred on to do its own domestic indigenous development, and so you'll end up with a separate and not equal development of AI around the world. Fine, except that what's going to be the governance around it? AI has the potential for being as positive, as you say, for maybe solutions for water, solutions for other world problems, but it also has the potential for huge disruption and danger in terms of interference in elections, or in terms of misinformation. What's going to be the governance around it? If you don't have cooperation between nations, and instead you have only competition, it's a very serious situation. My hope is that we get to a point much like we had with the nuclear proliferation, where at least you have some basic cooperation around basic norms and rules to try to get some of the major players at least to play by the same rule book. At the moment, we don't have that at all.
And as we're all hoping, of course, it will solve problems like lack of water. Still Waters Run Deep, Alex, and that's the title of a Latin American photo festival that you've found.
Yes, so this is a festival that's going on in the Bronx Documentary Centre in New York. It's opening this week. It's the 4th annual exhibition there of some of the best contemporary photography from Latin America. And there's a selection of pictures The Guardian have published on it, and they are just fabulous. I'm just really enjoying them. And I think particularly because what they show is kind of the diversity of Latin America, and also the sort of, really fascinating kind of contemporary cultural scene and art. There's so many beautiful ones that they've published, and I should love to see the exhibition if I've got the chance to go to New York. But the one that really got me is a photo by Lisandra Alvarez in Cuba. And it's a photo in Havana of a sort of older lady sitting in a house with kind of painted walls with sort of design of a plant, but she's holding in a very tender, sweet way a goose. Which I think must be a pet goose.
That's wonderful.
It's a really gorgeous picture, but I think what really got me about it is I've spent a lot of time in Havana, and there's something about that picture that really captures that city. I'm not, even though it's just one person, there's something about the kind of, yes, it's a little rundown, but there's a great beauty to it. And, I think also just people there sort of have, perhaps it's a contradictory thing, or perhaps it's very logical that somehow under communism you develop a strong individuality. But I've really noticed that when I'm there, and I think something about it completely got to me.
Well, that's something you know all about, is communism and individuality.
Well, I was just thinking as Alex was speaking that in these times when it's very easy to get extremely gloomy about the state of the world and the state of the United States, where I grew up, it is important to remember that even in places like Cuba or China, which went through decades of really terrible governments and horrific economic problems and sanctions, that still you do have this individual life that can flourish, and that people can find ways of sprouting through the cracks of the concrete. So I think it's a very lovely picture, which I think gives us some hope in rather gloomy and dark times.
I mean, about Cuba, I've been there a few times too, and it's never struck me that it's had the same kind of bleakness as somewhere like Russia or China.
I know. I mean, I once had a conversation with someone there about precisely that, which was such an illuminating conversation. I was staying at in a private house. There are some of those that are licensed with sort of to rent out 2 rooms to tourists, and was a very interesting guy who had been a sort of scientific advisor to the Cuban government, and he'd been sent to North Korea and so on. So I was having a chat to him. I said, "Well, what did you find about North Korea?" He said, "Oh, I hated it. You know, they all stand in rows. You can't make Cubans stand in rows. You know, and all this." But he had a very different conception of how life was under communism in somewhere like North Korea versus Cuba. And I think what he really emphasised is that actually in Cuba people, well, this is his perception. I mean, you know, North Koreans may of course have their own point of view on this, but that Cubans really had sort of, despite this umbrella of communism, had very much continued with their culture and, you know, their individual personalities and all that. And that's certainly something I found when I've been there, that I think, you know, without ignoring the economic issues and all of that have come up, they are very, very robust, independent people.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more. Just to highlight another new book, Phil Manzanera, who's the guitarist from Roxy Music, he also produces for a lot of people, including Pink Floyd and Coldplay and various others. His new book is called From Revolution to Roxy, and the revolution that he's talking about is the 1952 Cuban coup. His father was posted to Cuba along with his Colombian wife. Phil is half Colombian. And while they were there, Phil's just 7 years old, the revolution breaks out and there's shooting in his garden. And I mean, it's the most extraordinary story. And then Phil, whose real name is Target Adams, not Manzanera at all, Manzanera is his mother's name, gets sent to sort of British boarding school and becomes a sort of British boy, but actually has this fantastic kind of Latin background, which you hear when you listen to his own music rather than sort of particularly Roxy music or anything. And I just find it absolutely fascinating.
Isn't it? Yes, I mean, it doesn't come out much in Roxy music, but I mean, I love Roxy music, but yes, it doesn't do much. But how interesting that you get these stories. I noticed also this week there's been some publicity around Stuart Copeland from the police. Similarly, and his father was Miles Copeland, a very, very significant CIA agent in the Cold War, who I've written quite a lot about. And I always find it completely fascinating that you've got, you know, his father sort of gadding around in Egypt, working on NASA and all of this stuff, and then his son is, you know, the drummer in the police.
It's extraordinary, isn't it?
Yes.
Do you have a spy story for us, David?
I don't.
What do you really do?
No, I don't have a music story or a spy story, I'm afraid.
Oh, dear. Well, perhaps you can talk about ageing societies then.
Well, yes, next to water, that's my other obsession. I mean, of course, we have the issue of the U.S. election where you have 2 rather elderly men competing, but that's just a proxy for the wider story, which is that most of developed nations are getting very, very old. And that has really serious implications for who's going to do the work, who's going to pay the Social Security, who's going to keep these societies going. That's one of the issues that China is going to be dealing with in this third plenum, I hope. They have, because China's one-child policy for many years actually created a huge problem for them. They thought they were avoiding one demographic cliff, that they were going to be overpopulated and not be able to feed the people they had, and they ended up with another demographic problem, which is that they just simply won't have enough people to keep the society afloat. Well, kind of hard to say that with 1.4 billion, but it's true. You're going to end up with a lot of 50, 60, 70-year-olds and not very many 20 and 30-year-olds. But similar things are happening maybe on a smaller scale throughout Western Europe as well. Germany needs to have immigration because otherwise there will be nobody to keep the hospitals going and nobody to pay the Social Security bills.
Yeah, and I mean, this is a problem across the region. It's happening in Japan, very low birth rates. In South Korea, where a couple of weeks ago we did a story about how one of the cities there had become the first place that could be officially classified as going extinct because of the amount of elderly residents and just no new people being born. And also, of course, South Korea has, as does China, I'm sure, has these very strict immigration protocols, and people are not encouraged to come in. You can come in as a student, but you usually have to leave. They're looking at trying to change that. And that must, of course, be an issue in China too.
Absolutely. You cannot really become a Chinese citizen if you were not one already. But back to your earlier point about AI might be able to help, and robotics might be able to help some, not with paying the Social Security bills, but at least with taking care of people and providing some succor to the loneliness of old age. So perhaps when the three of us are in our dotage, we'll be surrounded by AI carers or robotic carers.
I think I'd rather go to Dignitas than deal with that. I'm afraid that sounds like the most depressing possible outcome. I mean, as the rainforests burn from this stuff, the idea that you're talking to an LLM, which, you know, is probably going to tell you to put rocks on your pizza into the bargain, really is just too depressing for words.
Well, and also, I mean, there is the whole thing of, does one want to get terrifically old? I mean, quite possibly not.
Quite possibly not. Well, I mean, it is a growing question. I think, you know, where obviously, you know, much as I just made a bleak joke about it, certainly in Britain there's a big debate about assisted dying. And my feeling has always been that governments will shift that way, not on ethical questions, but on practical questions. We simply can't afford the numbers of elderly people versus the very low birth rate that is happening.
Oh, very, very true. But if you just look at Mr. Biden and Mr. Trump, it's hard to say I'm giving up. It's hard to say I'm stepping back.
Absolutely.
And even more so if you're stepping back from life itself. It's one thing to step back from a job. It's one thing to step back from a career, but it's quite another thing to step back from life itself. So I think they're getting over that psychological hurdle to actually say, yes, it is time for the next generation to come up. Yes, maybe I am taking up a place that could be better used by somebody else. It will be quite difficult.
But then you've got to argue about, well, what is the correct age to do that, or what is the correct state of mind? And I know a couple of people actually who were members of I think it's called Exit, the charity that sort of is campaigning for people to have assisted dying, who had signed up saying that's what they wanted to have happen to them. But by the time they got to the point where they could say, all right, cart me off now, they were deemed too unwell to do so, and
yes.
it's very unfair. I mean, is it 85? Is it 97? For Alice Munro, of course, it was 92. I think she died at 92 years old in May this year. Since then, of course, we've had some very disturbing revelations about her, Alex.
Yes, this has been all that the world of literature has been talking about this week. Revelations, her daughter published a piece, Andrea Skinner published a piece in the Toronto Star, detailing that for a long, horrible period of her childhood, from the age of 9, she was sexually abused by Alice Munro, her mother's partner, so her stepfather. And I think possibly, you know, aside from the sheer horror of that, what really shocked a lot of people is that Andrea Skinner had told Alice Munro that this was happening, that everybody had been aware this was happening, and nobody stopped it. And in fact, Alice Munro stayed married to her partner and almost sort of reacted as if this was a question of infidelity. I mean, really sort of reacted against her daughter for telling her this.
Well, that was the really horrible thing that the stepfather said, that the daughter had seduced him. This 9-year-old had seduced him. I mean, which is just...
I know. He said it was a sort of Lolita Humbert situation, which implies he really hadn't read that book properly, because, I mean, really, that's a critique of that situation. But it's... yeah, I mean, it was a completely horrifying story, but I think it's brought up once again this kind of eternal debate about separating the art from the artist, and whether you can do this in this sort of discussion. But I think also some of the more interesting comment pieces I've seen on it try and sort of take it a bit beyond that, actually, into sort of, you know, trying to complicate that question rather than have a simple answer of yes or no, but actually talking about how you know, at some level you sort of can't really, because, for instance, so much of Alice Munro's writing is about families with dark secrets and dysfunction and women living with their impossible choices and all of this. And then how actually do we extract this knowledge from that analysis? I mean, they're so linked.
I mean, they always are, aren't they? I mean, you can think of obvious things like, I don't know, Woody Allen, for instance, right. and this whole thing of art and artists, or even Philip Roth.
Absolutely.
Who has a very dark backstory, but, you know, writes these. I mean, The Human Stain was one of the greatest works of literature. It's extraordinary.
Is it the secret that actually makes the artist? Then you could argue that perhaps having the secret is what pushed her to try to work through these issues in her art when she couldn't work through them in her life. And I suppose as readers or as the public, we benefit from that. There's always the question: are you enabling someone whom you do not respect anymore? Are you enabling the estate of someone whom you despise by paying them royalties? But I think that economic question is somehow separate from the artistic question. Is can you enjoy the writing per se? Can you enjoy and appreciate the working through of the issue on its own?
And are we still allowed to read and watch things which we disapprove of the creator?
Well, it becomes a complex question, and I think one of the best pieces I read on it was by the novelist Brandon Taylor, who had a really thoughtful, quite long response on his Substack, and he himself talks about how he was abused in a similar way. Family just sort of denied it had happened and covered it up and all of this. I think, unfortunately, that's really quite common. And, he talks about really how, his conclusion is you're never separating the art from the artist. You're creating a soft fantasy to make your own life more comfortable because you've decided to live in such a way that creates regimes of value that you do not want to own up to. You have confused your own frame of reference for an objective fact. And I found that's an incredibly striking contribution.
Absolutely.
So I think actually what I'm, hope if anything positive can come out of this awful situation, I think it's perhaps having that discussion on a deeper, more meaningful level and starting to think about that and, not sort of just standing back and thinking about am I still allowed to do whatever, but actually really thinking about how, the whole of art is constructed, indeed, as you say, and the whole of, our appreciation of it is coloured by our own experiences as well.
Now, I can't let you go without talking about summer because, of course, this is the time when people go off for their holes. During August, most people are away, it would seem to me, certainly in this hemisphere. But in India and Pakistan, it's also wedding season, as it is here. It's been called India's royal wedding, is happening this weekend, isn't it, Alex? It's hugely lavish. It's the son of India's richest man. It's been going on for days. This is the second part. There was a kind of pre-wedding where they went off on a cruise around the Med. Massive thing. Is this typical?
I mean, well, not on this level. The Ambani wedding is the story in India at the moment. I mean, absolutely massive. Obviously, this is, a multi-billionaire family. Incredible wealth, and their son, their scion, is getting hitched. And I mean, also all these celebrities are there. I must say, I've been hugely enjoying on various Indian and Pakistani friends' social media feeds, various sort of pictures of particularly Kim and Khloe Kardashian turning up in the sluttiest lehenga cholis I've ever seen in my life. I mean, sort of unbelievable outfits. Although plenty, I must say, of the Bollywood stars there giving them a run for their money. But sort of the most extraordinary outfits emerging from this do. I mean, because this is a family with huge international connections. So I mean, among the guests are Tony Blair, Boris Johnson, all sorts of people that we might try and avoid at the bar if we were at such a party. But also yes, celebrities from the US, from all over the world. It's quite an extraordinary event, and I think obviously there's a lot of response to it is that actually perhaps I think this huge vulgarity is rather on theme, actually, for an event of this scale in countries where poverty is so widespread.
Conspicuous consumption at its height, isn't it? Listen, we've got to close, but I want one sentence from each of you before we go about where you're going this summer and what you'll be wearing.
Well, as a matter of principle, my wife and I never travel during the summer because we hate to travel when everyone else is. So I'll be at home wearing just what I'm wearing now.
And very lovely you look too, David.
Thank you very much.
Alex?
Well, actually, I'm afraid we're the same. But I will be going away in September to California, and I shall be wearing the sluttiest lehenga choli that I can find to meet with the Kardashians.
And I'll be in the Hamptons. I'm going to sit with my very large hat on. Thank you both to you, to David Schlesinger, to Alex von Tunzelmann, also to Tom Edwards, Scott Lucas, Hannah Lucinda Smith and our own Tyler Brûlé. This programme was produced and studio engineered by Mariella Bevan. I'm Georgina Godwin. Monocle on Sunday returns next week.